Viking-era living was not for the girlies. If you were lucky to, well, grow up, you risked being forced into marriage, poisoned by the world, or worse. Human sacrifice was probably the gnarliest, though. Some contemporary sources tell us about sacrifices made to Odin, like the 99 people, horses, dogs, and hogs that were sacrificed every 9 years. There's another story that says Vikings assembled at Uppsala every 9 years to make sure they were still in good with the gods by sacrificing humans. Yeah, and then also they would hang them from the trees, just for funsies. Whether that story is true or just some anti-Viking propaganda is kinda debated, but the National Museum of Denmark says it's at least partially true. Evidence came when archaeologists excavated a sacrificial site at Trelleborg and found a well filled with animal bones and the skeletons of at least 5 human sacrifices. 4 of those were a little too young to mention. Don't worry, it gets even darker. According to historian Harry Brown, all that pop culture nonsense about willing sacrifices is, well, nonsense. Brown says there are no actual sources that mention sacrifices being willing participants. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite. One human who wrote back in the 10th century told the tale of a slave girl who tried to back out of being a sacrifice. Instead of being freed, she was dragged to meet her end, a death that only came after she was harmed by no less than 6 different men. Just goes to show that history was disgusting. Killing new humans was shockingly common throughout history. Just look at the burial sites we found for Roman ones. And the Vikings were no different. And they had this tradition built into their naming rituals. Christening a new human with a particular name comes from the Vikings. The ritual is called Åsa Vatni, and it only happened after parents examined their new descendant and decided if he or she was worth raising. Ones who weren't worth keeping were left to die by exposure, and according to historian Nancy L. Wicker, it was frequently done with the girls. Lots of them. Records of Viking households suggest that boys outnumbered girls at least 4 to 1, and even up to 9 to 1. That's not how biology works, so something had to happen to those girls. It also has to be said that Vikings didn't view this act as a criminal one, as long as it was done before the Åsa Vatni. After the human was named and accepted into the family, it was a problem. But before? Go nuts. Looking at architecture, Viking longhouses are pretty cool. Who doesn't want one in their backyard for barbecuing meats and drinking lots of fun substances? There's a catch though, and it became painfully clear when researchers from Denmark's university built their longhouse replicas, lit some fires, then did some tests. The houses were as authentically Viking as people could get, made with a lot of specifics according to the history books. So these researchers lit fires in the center of each house and monitored interior conditions for 15 weeks of winter. When they compared their findings to what the World Health Organization deems safe, they found those cool Viking longhouses were constructed in a way that encouraged a collection of fine particles, nitrogen dioxide, and carbon monoxide. You know, the stuff we make special detectors to warn us so we don't die in our sleep. Well, there was a hole in the roof for smoke, not all the smoke left. That same roof design trapped a lot of it, and once it cooled, all the nastiness in the air dropped to ground level. They say short-term exposure wasn't too dangerous, but long-term exposure, like Viking women would have had, leads to things like respiratory infections, bronchitis, oh, and cancer. Fun. It's believed the Viking Age started in 793 AD, when raiders, probably from Norway, attacked a monastery off of the coast of northeastern England. The Vikings continued to raid villages and other nunneries across the European coast until 1066. However, researchers aren't really sure why the Vikings began their raids. One theory, though, is that the men might have wanted women because of that whole male to female ratio. Yay, thank you all that gender stuff that we spoke about a moment ago. This has led some researchers to believe that the main reason Viking men started invading different areas in Europe wasn't just to pillage. They were focused on kidnapping women to be their wives. Some genetic testing that was performed on modern Icelandic citizens backs up this theory. What they tested was the specific mitochondria that you get from your mom and your dad. The Vikings colonized Iceland over 8,000 years ago, and since then, there's been relatively little migration to the country. So researchers were able to formulate where those settlers of Iceland came from. Their testing found that about 80% of male settlers in Iceland came from Norway, and 63% of the women settlers came from the British Isles. This would suggest that there was large-scale interbreeding between the Norwegian men and women from the areas where the Vikings invaded. It's incredibly unlikely that the women would have immigrated to Iceland by themselves on their own free will. If you're looking for proof that Vikings had an upside down, somewhat ironic sense of crime and punishment, welcome. While Vikings were known for their brutal behavior on the battlefield, their treatment of the women they kidnapped in order to serve as concubines, wives, and laborers was even worse. If a female slave was found guilty of committing an infraction against her owners, her hands and feet were chopped off as punishment. And sometimes They'd even brand her face. Gotta make sure everybody knows that right there is a criminal. Technically, women couldn't even be Vikings. As a famed historian, author of Woman in the Viking Age has pointed out, the Old Norse word Vikingara only applied to men, usually to those men who embarked from Scandinavia in their famous long boats and sailed to such far-flung places as Britain, Europe, Russia, the North Atlantic Islands, and North America. So this next little tidbit isn't especially unique to the Vikings, but it does have enough of a yuck factor to make it worthy of mentioning. According to historians, the average Viking family didn't really have a barn to keep their animals in, so they did what any rational non-barn owning person would do: they just kept all the farm animals in the house. This was okay for a couple of important purposes. First, it ensured that Buddy from the longhouse down the street, who you nearly killed in a swimming match a couple of days ago, wouldn't try stealing your cow out of spite. And then also it brings that lovely source of heat into your home, which helps you save money on, I don't know, other heat sources. I'm assuming there was some sort of poop cleaning routine in a Viking longhouse, but still, you'd have to have somebody standing behind the cows with a sack pretty much 24/7 if you expected to keep that smell anywhere close to under control. So it's probably safe to assume that a home was a pretty stinky place. Warm and somewhat energy efficient, but stinky and unhygienic. Being a Viking was a pretty great job because if you didn't die, you got to loot and pillage, and if you did die, then you got to go to Valhalla, hang out with Thor, which basically parallels the modern American fantasy of hanging out with like Bruce Lee or Arnold Schwarzenegger in the afterlife, but Arnold isn't dead, well, as of right now. Anyway, it was pretty cool for the Vikings, but for everybody else, it was absolutely freaking terrifying. And when you knew that the Vikings were on their way, you really only had two rational options: run away, or panic first and then run away. Pretty straightforward. According to the history books, the Vikings had such a terrifying reputation that one group of nuns living in a Scottish convent decided they'd better just go ahead and disfigure themselves rather than face potentially being defiled at the hands or other body parts of an invading Viking force. So instead of running, for reasons that are really not clear, they cut off their own noses. And just as an extra precaution, they also got rid of their upper lips. When the Vikings arrived, they were sufficiently put off by the horrible scene to not be interested in deflowering anybody. But they were so enraged that they decided to burn down the convent and everyone in it. So not only did the whole losing body parts thing suck for those nuns, they all ended up dying horribly anyways. So you've probably heard about how drinking bone broth can help you sleep, make your bones stronger, totally solve climate change. Okay, that was a fib, but there's some hype. So the Vikings used soup as medicine, specifically onion soup, but it wasn't for treating, it was more of a diagnostic tool. A really gross one. According to my sources, Viking healers would force feed a strong onion soup to any warrior who had a wound to the abdomen. This served as a canary in the colon, kind of like a mine situation. So if the healer could smell the soup through the wound, that meant the injury included the stomach or intestines, which also meant it was fatal. And it was pretty handy knowledge because it meant that the healer could move on to another patient, rather than waste time and effort with the guy who was almost dead. Very compassionate. Finally, take a look online anywhere. Today, you see all kinds of body mod stuff, but the Vikings had their own ideas about it. In 2006, famed anthropologist Caroline Archini published her findings on the 557 Viking skeletons she looked at. There were 24 of them that had a series of horizontal lines filed into their teeth. And if the idea of taking a sharp object to your teeth and filling in grooves doesn't make you cringe, wow. No one's sure just why these particular people decided to do this particular thing, but William Fitzhugh of the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History thinks they may have gotten the idea after making contact with West African peoples. Native American tribes have been found to have filed their teeth in a similar horizontal pattern, though while Africa's teeth modifiers sharpen their pearly whites into points, so a little different. Wherever the Vikings got the idea, the practice is so precisely done that anthropologists believe it took some serious professional level skill to do it right. Do with this what you will. That's the end, folks. I've been Alexa, resident emo girly. See ya! Evidence came when archaeologists Finally for today, take a look online anywhere. You're gonna see all kinds of